Assalamualaikum, selamat petang, selamat pagi, namaste, namaskar, 大家好, konbanwa, hapari ommani batim. Hello, hola, bonjour, 안녕하십니까. Welcome to the 6th episode of World Mediation Deacons. This is DK. I'm cathartic to have my guest today. His name is Bruce Edwards. Bruce is one of the founders and board members of JAMS, and JAMS is the world's largest private alternative dispute resolution provider, which was founded in 1979. JAMS handles annually 18,000 cases on average, so he's the Zeus in ADR industry, as he created a whole new ecosystem in private ADR industry. In addition, a few years ago, along with his wife Susan, he founded Edwards Mediation Academy, an online education platform. Hello, Bruce. Welcome to the show.
Hello, DK. Pleasure to meet you and delighted to be here with your audience. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Could you introduce yourself, where you were born, raised, educated, and career path up to now?
Certainly. I was born in the San Francisco Bay Area and have lived here all of my life with some brief trips in different directions, and grew up down in the shadow of Silicon Valley, where Stanford University is located, and have lived and raised my children in the San Francisco area for most of my adult life. Educationally, I went to the University of California, undergraduate with a degree in psychology. Little did I know at the time how significant a role that would play in my future career development, but I always knew I wanted to go to law school. And so after I graduated from the University of California, I went to another University of California, the legal campus called Hastings Law School, also in San Francisco. And that was my formal sort of education before I began working as a litigator in a San Francisco law firm now 42 years ago. So that's my background.
So when you changed your career from litigator to full-time mediator?
So it's an interesting story because I was once asked by a reporter when I was teaching in India, how did I choose mediation? And I had to remind them that I didn't choose mediation because in those days when I started in 1985, 36 years ago, there was no mediation to choose. It was something that organically we began to develop. And my life story in retrospect is more of, I think, the universe choosing me than me choosing the universe. I grew up in a family where my parents unfortunately were divorced, but that put me at an early age in between siblings and parents needing to try and solve disputes. I managed to pay my way through college by working at various jobs that had me assisting people through conflicts at various, both as in the dormitory where I was in charge and also in a men's resource center. And so by the time I got to law school and was becoming trained as a litigator, I was already predisposed to be thinking about other ways of resolving disputes. And early on in my representation of clients as a litigator, probably DK, much the same you found when you were representing your clients, it was just dissatisfying. I mean, not only was it expensive and lengthy and those things that we all know, but more at a core proposition, we just weren't doing for them what our forebears in the legal profession had set out to do, which was to find solutions that met our clients' needs and address their concerns. And so I started looking around and looking at family law mediation and looking at other approaches. And I started inviting my adversaries into conversations, then still representing parties in litigation. And while those conversations were often messy, loud, I found certain things happened as we started to bring people together. We started to break through some of the impasse. We started to be creative in putting our heads together to find solutions. And so after really only about 5 years in the law firm, I started doing this process on the side. And for about 4 years, I would what we call moonlight or experiment in mediations. And that's really what awakened me to the real power of this process. Before I then started what was much to the chagrin of my parents and family who saw me walking away from a lucrative partnership in an established San Francisco law firm to start something that nobody had ever heard of, which was applying mediation in the context of commercial litigation in the United States. And I joined with a partner, John Bates at the time, who was similarly motivated, a little older and more established than I, but we both walked away from our respective law firms with the prospect of knocking on doors and trying to change an industry. And that's really how I evolved from being a sort of dissatisfied career litigator very early on in my career to experimenting and ultimately becoming one of the first mediation companies in the United States.
Oh, so that law firm's name was James or something else?
So my former law firm's name was Sedgwick. I started the first mediation company with John Bates, and we were known then as the Bates Edwards Group. Approximately 2 years into growing our business, we grew our business to about 6 offices on the West Coast. And then we ran into some Harvard-trained lawyers on the East Coast who were doing a similar kind of thing. And they had developed a company called End Dispute. And we first joined forces with End Dispute to become the first national mediation company formed exclusively by former lawyers. And then shortly thereafter, we connected with this company called Judicial Arbitration and Mediation Services, which was a company running in parallel track, formed by former and retired judges handling settlement conferences. And we began to have a dialogue about merging our respective companies. And we looked at a site map. I think we had at the time about 14 offices around the country, none but one overlapping. And we could merge all of our then lawyer mediators with the retired judges and quickly become the largest mediation and arbitration company in the United States, rendering private mediation and arbitration services. And that's how we got started in 1993, then known as JAMS End Dispute, but later becoming just known as JAMS.
So 3 different firms merged into one JAMS.
Indeed. Indeed.
First time I know JAMS, it was quite surprising how private dispute resolution market could survive and flourish in the country, because as far as I know, Asian countries, mediation is court-driven or some government-driven, but private-driven dispute resolution market could be successful in terms of either money or reputational or success rate it is. And is there any reason why JAMS is so successful in the United States? Because one of your class, you told me that the revenue of JAMS is 19th among all United States law firms. I'm not sure whether I remember correctly. So it's quite successful by law firm by itself. So not only just dispute resolution part, but this part as well, JAMS is successful. And is there any reason you can share?
There's a lot of reasons. And I was chairman of the board for 3 years and served on the board for a dozen more. So I've been involved in corporate governance at the same time I mediate every day. So I'm very fluent in the sort of business dynamics of establishing a mediation company and a mediation culture. And having taught mediation in now over 25 countries in person, I appreciate more fully that there are a couple different ways to implement mediation within a legal or judicial culture and a society at large. In many countries, it's aided by the fact that there's a backlog in the court system and a denial of access to justice. And in the early days in the United States, that had helped us launch this profession as well. Parties sometimes waited 2 or 3 years to get a courtroom or a jury or both. And of course, in many countries around the world, it's even more of a pronounced and lengthy wait for court access. So that did help us. But we also had, I think, a sophisticated consumer base ultimately, not just lawyers, but I mean ultimate clients, whether they're construction companies or insurance companies or just other high-tech, other types of businesses. I think people are sophisticated enough to appreciate what I've become to describe as the value proposition of mediation. And the value proposition of mediation really sells itself, meaning the more you understand about how mediation works, the benefits that it provides, particularly in contrast to arbitration and litigation, the more people are convinced it's the right answer. And then once people go through the process itself, as we talk about, all of life learning is experiential. And when people experience learning in mediation, they really want to come back time and time again. And so to answer your question specifically, whether it's cost savings or time savings or the benefit of staying in control of decisions throughout the process, or it's the opportunity to preserve long-standing relationships with employees or customers. I could go on about the value proposition of mediation, but it is manifold. And I never envisioned myself as a salesperson coming up through college and law school. But when I left the law firm in the first instance to begin marketing the new company, Bates Edwards Group, I found myself in this moment of having to really sell the concept of mediation in the first instance, and then convince people that my partner or I were the right people to choose, although in those days there weren't too many options. But my point in all of this is when we started mediation in the United States, there was no court annex process. My first business plan that I wrote envisioned that courts would wake up to the value of mediation to assist with their case management within 5 or 10 years of us starting this from a commercial standpoint. And we showed that one can drive mediation from the bottom up, really from the basis of a consumer demand in the commercial setting as readily and if not more efficiently than coming at it from the top down, meaning through legislature, edict, or judicial reference.
So back then, there was no court annexed mediation in the United States.
There was not.
I see. So it's quite different because in most Asian countries, including Korea, there is a court annexed mediation first, and judges mediator normally, and there is a non-judge professional full-time mediator in the court, and they do kind of evaluative mediation and not facilitative mediation. And so the story is quite different.
And that's true in most other countries I have found traveling around the world, whether we're setting up mediation in Rwanda or Brazil or the Republic of Georgia or a dozen other countries. Our best toehold in advancing the concept of mediation is to meet first with the Minister of Justice or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and try and advance the many benefits of mediation as an adjunct to the court system, and then slowly start to educate and buy in the judges, the registrars, ultimately the full stakeholder group of attorneys before we move into a broader world of who are the consumers of mediation services in a commercial setting. Should we reach out then to bankers and CEOs of businesses and construction companies to help educate them so we can round out the broadest possible influence that mediation has to offer?
Understood. Other than GEMS, is there any second-tier private ADR service provider in the US?
Absolutely. I mean, we have spawned an industry, quite literally. And so every city we go, there are individual retired judges or maybe groups of retired lawyers, maybe some still practicing law that are working part-time as mediators. But I've taught mediation to those with a burgeoning mediation practice at Pepperdine University for almost 30 years. And those mediators, many of whom go off into private mediation practices, government work, ombuds roles and things. And so there are a lot of competition in the commercial mediation space, just nothing as well organized and successful as JAMS. Everything that is our competition is usually very local, or in a couple instances, regional. Like we may have some other companies in California who are our competition, but they haven't expanded to the rest of the country like we have.
I see. I'm asking this question because I was wondering of the future of GEMS, because it seems like GEMS is kind of monopoly in the United States. And if there is any competitor, then it could be merged like other law firms. The law firms are merging and spinning off, and there's an ecosystem. But I'm not aware of any other big ADR firm providing mediation service other than GEMS. So I wonder the future of GEMS.
It's interesting. As a business model, one of the things that, of course, is a blessing and a curse, it's a personal service business. So the blessing is we survive because we focus on quality, trying to gather the best practitioners of mediation skills and continue to train them and try and set ourselves apart from the competition in that way. It's a bit of a curse because unlike many businesses, it's hard to leverage. Our talent is 2 steps away from walking out the door in the event they aren't satisfied with JAMS as the parent company, or otherwise just want to move out on their own in a different fashion. So it's a little bit of a different business model that we've had to struggle to develop over the years by looking at physician organizations, accountant organizations, and other personal service businesses to find the right model to be able to sustain and grow the business. I think we have found that by and large. Others either aren't willing to invest the capital or maybe are sufficiently behind us in many ways that they just don't want to start. But I do think we will continue to grow. I think we'll continue to further implement and deepen our roots, not just in sort of commercial world, but hopefully ultimately expanding the idea of mediation into other sectors of society and how we benefit from that, obviously, as part of our business conversation going forward. But it is an exciting time because it's a nascent profession and one that is evolving. And when I teach mediation and talk to mediation, young mediators, particularly those coming out of law schools, I say it's important to remember that the majority of professional tracks in mediation have probably not yet been invented. So if you think about it that way, coming out of school 30 years ago, most people didn't think there was a mediation profession, certainly hadn't been trained for it in law school. Now, at least law schools are starting to train mediators, but I challenge law students coming out of school and young mediators, marry your own talents with your passion. Look for a way to implement mediation in whatever way it makes sense for you, because the world is so full of conflict. That's really the only limitation for your career advancement. It doesn't just have to happen in a commercial setting.
I see. So GEMS mainly provide mediation service, but arbitration service as well, right?
Yes, I'd say we're about 70% mediation services and about 30% arbitration. And many of our cases come from stair-step clauses in contracts like construction disputes, where the first step is the parties must try mediation, and if that fails, then they can move on to arbitration. So still the majority of our cases are mediation. Yet about 80% of my partners are retired judges, maybe 75%, which presents its own challenge. You've already indicated in Korea that a lot of the court-sponsored mediation follows an evaluative format. And certainly in the United States, those that come from a judicial background are seemingly predisposed to be somewhat evaluative in their approach. So there's a sort of a constant tension between training judges to expand their skill set and to appreciate the value of facilitative mediation. At the same time, they bring the strength of their position, their reputational gravitas, and their evaluative prowess into the conversation.
You see. On last episode, I interviewed Jeremy Lack, and he told about the integration of whole different type of dispute resolution, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, litigation, whatever, and integrate everything and choose best solution methods for the clients. And if that's possible, that would be great. And is there any plan for GEMS to provide such services after consulting the client? Oh, this methodology is the best for you. And whether it's a mediation, arbitration, whether it's evaluative, facilitative, there is no right answer, right? It's case by case, and every client has different needs.
So, yeah, a couple of questions, important ones you raised. There is no right and wrong answer in terms of how one approaches mediation, other than the only wrong answer is the one that's not thoughtful, the one that's not strategic, the one that doesn't appropriately reflect the client's needs and interests. Therein, it can be a wrong answer. But in terms of the technique itself, it's simply a question of how to match that technique with the moment, with the case, with the client's needs and interests. I love Jeremy Lack. We've had lots of late night conversations, talking about mediation over the years, both in my house and his. And the multi-door approach is a fascinating one. I have sort of expanded on that concept to talk about it from the standpoint of not just being responsive to litigation, what I call sort of the palliative side of dispute resolution, but I am really partially focused on the preventative side. How does one address conflict in the moment, be it in the workplace or with neighbors or other things, in ways that can manage the conflict, make it productive if possible, but otherwise keep it from escalating into something worse. And so, for example, 7 or 8 years ago, a colleague of mine who was the head of physicians at Stanford University Hospital invited me and two colleagues to come in and teach preventative mediation to the heads of nursing, to the heads of physicians, and to the C-suite, the CEO, the CFO, the information technology officers, and all the corporate administration of the hospital. And after several weeks of training, we were training them to be better communicators, to better handle and address conflict when it arose in the moment, giving them strategies and techniques. And the CEO of the company, of the hospital, came up to me at the end of the training and said, "Bruce, we have a crash cart that we take into a patient's room if they experience a traumatic event like a heart attack or a stroke. We need to have a dispute resolution crash cart in our hospital based on the techniques that you've taught us, so we can incorporate them into our daily practice to address conflict." And it's that concept of teaching people how to be more mediation competent, emotionally competent, better communicators, and in ways that advance their thinking about conflict, so that conflicts don't necessarily have to just appear on our doorstep when they're in litigation or worse. And we have this tremendous opportunity to expand this discussion much further than we have in the last 30 years. That's part of what gets me excited.
Thank you so much. Other than GEMS, you started a new initiative a few years ago, Edwards Mediation Academy. Can you explain why you established this academy with your wife and how it's going up to now?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So if I mediate every day and have for over 30 years, some people think that's a full-time job in and of itself, and I would agree. But I'm also passionate about teaching, as perhaps you can tell. And I taught at Pepperdine for so many years, as well as other law schools around the country. And I realized about 10 years ago that a couple things that formed the motivation for my wife and I developing Edwards Mediation Academy. And my wife is not a lawyer or mediator, but she is a graduate of Stanford Business School, has an MBA, and is very business oriented. And she recognized my passion for teaching. And at the time, I was trying to, as chairman of the board of JAMS, get JAMS enthusiastic about training and recognizing the potential for expanding our reach beyond the United States through training and education. And as we say in mediation, the right answer at the wrong time is still the wrong answer. And 10 years ago, JAMS wasn't ready for that idea or that business plan. And so my wife suggested, why don't we do it together? And I liked the idea. And as I said, there were two things that motivated me. One, I was giving a keynote address to the International Academy of Mediators in Los Angeles one year. And I was looking around the audience and I said, I look around this audience and I see some of the best mediation trainers in the United States. Maybe there's 50 of us. And I calculate how many students you're able to get in front of each year. And maybe it's 1,000 each. And so there's 50,000 students we have a chance of impacting. Well, guess what? If I drew a circle on the map around downtown Los Angeles and went 10 miles in every direction, we would encapsulate 50,000 lawyers, which means we could work for a year and only reach the lawyers in Los Angeles County. And yet the state and the country and the world are in desperate need of so much more mediation. How can we address that? And so that was the first motivation that I took to develop Edwards Mediation Academy, was this idea by putting these lessons online in a novel way that would reach and influence young mediators, I could leverage much of the learning that I had accomplished in the last 30 years to a broader audience. And the second thing that motivated me was I was fortunate enough when I left my law firm to be a young man in my early 30s. And that gave me an advantage in terms of many of my peers who came along as other pioneers in this profession. Many were older, most were. Many were retired judges. Maybe some were accomplished older statesmen as lawyers. And yet many people were starting to retire or worse from the profession 10 years ago. And I really wanted to capture their stories. I wanted to capture those valuable lessons that they had developed in the mediation rooms and help incorporate those stories into my teachings. And so I set about to interview those people, and maybe over the course of 2 years, I interviewed 30 people on camera for 2 or 3 hours each about their experiences in mediation. not unlike what you're doing now, DK, and developing those stories so that when my wife and I then set about to work with our learning instructors and develop an interactive format for the courses we now have online, we could incorporate the best lessons from the most experienced mediators. And that was really the genesis of the Edwards Mediation Academy. And it's our ongoing commitment to add courses. So we now have courses in developing careers in mediation. We have courses on mediation advocacy for lawyers, teaching lawyers how to better navigate the nuances of mediation, as well as all the courses on developing mediation skills. But as you've pointed out, I like to provide thought leadership by thinking about the mediation, writing blogs, providing webinars, and continuing to support the people that have taken our courses, because learning is a lifelong venture and we continue to learn from each other. And so it's great to have Edwards Mediation Academy as a platform. There's really a forum for people to come together and share that knowledge.
Wow. How is it possible? Every day you mediate cases and you need to attend a webinar and go to the law school teaching. And in addition, you do the mediation Edwards company. How is it possible? Do you have two bodies?
Well, just to round out the picture, I've actually worked on several boards as well. One that is a board called the Weinstein International Foundation, where we support international mediators that we've trained through JAMS in the United States. And that really supports a lot of my international travel. So next month, I'm going to be on the road for 3.5 weeks to the Middle East and several countries in Africa, trying to implement mediation, trying to train mediators that we've been working with remotely during the pandemic, but to meet them in person and add value to their education and training, and just a variety of things that all complement each other. Certainly, I'm able to incorporate stories from my mediations in my various teaching lessons and skill development moments, both mistakes that I've made as well as lessons that I've learned. And so it all sort of fits nicely together, but certainly it keeps me busy, as you can tell.
Does Bruce Mediation Academy provide some interactive actual mediation practice within the academy itself?
So it's a good question. Certainly when we started the academy, one of the things we did was begin by investigating what other courses were out there. And in those days, the courses were a talking head, a professor standing up in front of a classroom, basically delivering a lecture. And we didn't want that, certainly. So what we did is we hired an educational consultant who specialized in helping us learn how adults learn online. And one of the things that we determined was that adults, if they're forced to sit and listen to hours of lecture, they really retain about 10% of that information. But if they can be interactive, if you can figure out a way to engage them, to address various lessons in the coursework, to change the modality of learning, meaning not just me, but listening to other people, answering questions, reflecting on things in the moment, all of that increases their learning up to about 70%. And so we've developed the courses to be interactive, but they're also developed to be taken at one's own pace. So they're not live from the sense that I'm there interacting with you. But we also added to the course something that I think is unique. So for example, our course on advanced mediation skills, we spent 3 days filming a role play that I wrote. We brought in 6 different parties. We brought in lawyers. We brought in actors. We filmed, as I said, for 3 days. And we run that role play along through the skill development course. It's like a thread that runs through it, almost like if you're playing a video game, you're trying to get to the end. This real life example taken from a real mediation, but played out in a role play, is both very authentic and very experiential for people. So they'll learn about a certain stage of the mediation process, and they'll see it play out. I even use the role play in some of my courses where in a classroom where I'll play a vignette from that role play, push pause on the screen, and then ask somebody to step in the moment as a mediator to finish the sentence and address the conflict in the moment. And it gets that experiential and really helps people develop their thinking about how a mediation looks and feels in real time.
Wow, this is kind of game, right? If I choose yes and go this different scenario, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. While I read some of your articles in LinkedIn, one of the articles was quite interesting. It was 1991 mediation story at Washington, D.C. between international conglomerate and a joint State Department of Transportation surrounding the Beltway. And you were talking about it was very early age and mediator's mind and the ego management is quite important and extra. And can you tell us the full story behind that and why the ego management of mediators is so important?
Well, I start with this concept I've developed called the mediator's mind. And the mediator's mind is really a descriptive phrase that really contemplates a philosophical paradigm that we all develop for ourselves. And it impacts our every intervention in the mediation process. For example, if you consider yourself a facilitative mediator who's open to repairing relationships, listening to the needs and interests of the parties, being patient with your time and attention, it's going to cause you to convene a mediation in a certain way. It's going to influence the kinds of questions that you ask. It's going to influence how much time you spend listening to the parties. Conversely, if you're someone who's a court annexed mediator and you're given 4 files that you need to return to the court clerk by the end of the day, stamped either settled or not settled, it's going to influence how you approach that mediation as well. It doesn't necessarily mean one is right and wrong or good or bad. It just means that we have a different paradigm, a mental model that we've constructed for ourselves that does influence everything that follows. Part of my mental model personally is I've had to try and think about the tension we all face in mediation as it relates to our egos. So, for example, when I walk into a first meeting in a hotel conference center with 50 lawyers all gathered around, whether it's a large construction case or an airplane crash disaster or some mega tort case involving class action of many parties, whatever, I have to have enough strength of ego to know that I can manage that group, all of their disparate and competing concerns, get that case started in a way that manages people and time effectively and puts us on the right path. And yet, I also know that in most cases, I have to have a sufficient absence of ego, an absence of ego that reflects the fact that this is the party's dispute. And who am I to tell them what's right for them, particularly without really knowing them much better than I do at the beginning of the process? And the way I've described that absence of ego side of the tug of war, if you will, is I think of myself as a guest at someone else's dispute. Over the years, I've had this debate, particularly with a friend of mine I teach with in Austria, who's a psychotherapist and mediator, but he suggests maybe it'd be better to think of myself as a host at someone else's dispute. Either way, I think the message is the same. There's a limitation on how early on and how aggressively we assert ourselves in that dispute moment. And the better course is to come in and to listen and to make sure that we aren't moving quickly in the direction of evaluating somebody else's claim and really allow that dispute to breathe until we're much further along and we can get a sense of direction, all the while attending to people's needs, all the while trying to develop deep connections with the parties. And so it's that absence of ego that I think is so hard for many mediators to implement. And that case you described, where I was mediating a dispute of a 50-mile beltway around the city of Atlanta that had been for the Summer Olympics that were held that following year in Atlanta. And the dispute had been going on for a number of years between the Department of Transportation and this construction company. And after 7 or 8 hours of listening to the 20 or 30 people involved, the lawyers, the experts, the clients, I simply decided to take the 2 business leaders, the 2 decision makers, for a walk. And I took them for a walk and I said, look, I don't have an ego in who prevails in this dispute, but I can tell you that this is mutually assured destruction. And the good news is that you both are new leaders, one for the construction company, one for the government entity. You're not the ones who were involved when this conflict arose. So you have this unique opportunity to put things behind you. What I'd ask you to do is think about an absence of ego. And I'd think about you just walking through this garden and talking amongst yourselves, between yourselves, about how things could be resolved today. And I'm just going to wait here while you do that. And they walked probably for 20 minutes and came back to me and said, I think we've reached agreement. We need to put this behind us. And I took both of the gentlemen back into the hotel conference center, and much to the dismay of all the assembled people who'd been billing for years on this particular dispute, the two business executives said, we're done. I want the lawyers to draft up an agreement. Thank you, Bruce. You can fly back to the West Coast and we'll get on with what we do best, which is building roads and bridges. And so that's just an example of how sort of the lack of ego comes into play from the mediator's perspective, and how important it is to sort of manage one's ego in this process.
Oh, so what happened between them?
I think I just helps them look at things through a different lens, DK. I think I helped them understand that this dispute was not of their making, that they had a unique opportunity to try and put it behind them and claim success or victory in that exercise. And then by my words and deed and demeanor, tried to get them adopting the right tone with each other, one that wasn't trying to one-up the other company or fall back on tired, unsuccessful arguments, but simply to try and envision the path forward, one that could theoretically include business development ideas between the two of them, and they stood to benefit from that as well. So by kind of getting them on a unique course, I think I was able to steer them away from ego and steer them toward kind of mutual exchange.
So do you have any routine, training your ego or minds?
Well, yes, quite simply. One of the challenges we all face is to develop listening skills, appropriate listening skills for mediators. And for the most part, we all lead busy lives. Our minds are always active. We know that from brain research. It's a learned exercise to learn to quiet one's mind. Life is focused attention, I'm told by those neurobiologists, those who study the brain. And somehow we have to quiet our minds and be able to focus our attention on the dispute at hand. So a little device that I use is when I'm about to enter a room for a conversation with people, I put my hand on the doorknob and I pause and I take 2 or 3 deep breaths. And that's a reminder to me to quiet myself, to try and free myself of whatever moment had brought me to that doorstep. Maybe it was coming from a different conference call. Maybe it was the conversation in the last room. But it's really to focus on the people that I'm about to encounter and how can I give them the undivided attention that they so desperately require and deserve. And in that moment, free myself to come in and listen with the kind of interest and curiosity that the mediation demands.
See, so listening part is one of the most important thing for a mediator.
Absolutely. We often ask classroom full of students, be they college-age students, law school students, or practitioners who want to be better mediators, how many people had courses in writing growing up and they all smile and they raise their hand? And how many people learn how to read through a classroom instruction? They all smile and they raise their hand. How many had courses in oratory or rhetoric and improved your speaking skills? And a few hands go up, and then I say, now how many of you had a course in listening? And not a hand gets raised. And it's such an important part of our human interaction. It's the beginning of all understanding, and yet we pay it such little attention and give it so little skill development. If I had people committed to a 5-day course, I could spend 3 days teaching them to be better listeners. And irrespective of what other things I did not teach them, they'd still be better off because I devoted that much time to improving their listening skills. As my father used to say when I went away to summer camp and he'd write me a letter, he'd say, remember, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use it accordingly.
It's quite interesting. And one of your articles, and your father told you that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Can you elaborate that story as well?
Yeah, my father had a lot of good expressions, and that to me just underscores the importance of really trying to implement, really trying to put into action your idea.